The dried flowers still had color in 'em. That was the strange thing. 3 weeks Tobias Redding had been buying fresh ones from the mercantile every Friday morning, and 3 weeks running he had carried them home unwilted, pressed flat under his Bible, because a man did not like to waste what he had paid good money for. Friday again. The Copperline Station platform in Belhaven, Wyoming Territory, baked under a July sun that made the rails shimmer like water that was not there. Tobias stood where he always stood, at the far end near the water tower, holding a bunch of black-eyed Susans wrapped in brown paper, watching the bend in the track where the eastbound train would first show itself as a smudge of smoke against the hills. She was not on the last train. She had not been on the one before that either. The station clerk noticed him before she meant to. Lynn Toy had worked the ticket window at Belhaven for 8 months, ever since her uncle's freight business had folded and she had needed wages that did not depend on a man's temper. She was 21 years old, and she wore a gray prairie dress that had once belonged to the station master's late wife, taken in at the waist because Lynn was slighter than the woman had been. She kept the ticket ledger neater than any clerk before her, and she had learned in 8 months exactly which passengers to worry about and which to leave alone. Tobias Redding was one to worry about, not because he caused trouble, because he came back. The train that Friday brought 4 passengers off in Belhaven, a drummer selling patent medicine, 2 ranch hands returning from Cheyenne with new boots, an elderly woman visiting her son. No young woman traveling alone, no trunk marked with a name Lynn had memorized without meaning to. Miss Constance Whitfield of Springfield, Missouri. Tobias watched all 4 step down. He watched the conductor swing back aboard. He watched the train pull out toward the western grade, and then he stood there a moment longer with the flowers going soft in his grip, as if the platform might produce her anyway if he waited past the leaving. Lynn closed her ledger. She had told herself the first Friday that it was none of her business, and she had told herself the same thing the second Friday, and now it was the third Friday, and she found herself stepping out from behind the ticket window before she had decided to. "Mr. Redding?" She said his name because she had seen it on a telegram slip 2 weeks back, sent to the station for holding, never claimed. "Who are you waiting for?" He turned like a man caught at something private. Up close he was younger than she had guessed from a distance, maybe 28, with the kind of sun-weathered face that came from squinting into distance rather than age. His hands were rope-scarred and steady, but his eyes, when they met hers, had the particular stillness of a man holding something very carefully so it would not spill. "A woman," he said. "Was supposed to be a woman." Supposed to be? Mail order arrangement. Threw a marriage paper out of Missouri. We wrote letters going on 5 months now. He looked down at the flowers as if he had forgotten he was holding them, then back up, and something in his jaw tightened before he spoke again. She was to arrive on the Friday train 3 weeks running. First week I figured a delay. Second week I figured worse. This week I don't know what to figure. "You've written to her?" "3 times since the first missed train. No answer." Lynn considered this. She had processed enough telegrams and enough mail through the Belhaven office to know what silence usually meant, and none of the meanings were kind. But she also knew better than to say so to a man holding wilting flowers like they were the last rope on a cliff face. "The eastbound comes through again Tuesday," she said, "and Friday after that." "I know the schedule, ma'am. I know it better than the station master does, probably." There was no bitterness in it, only a kind of exhausted honesty, and that honesty was what made Lynn do something she had not planned. "There's a telegraph line runs to Springfield through the relay office in Laramie," she said. "Faster than a letter. If you wanted to know something before you spent another Friday standing here." He looked at her properly then, the way a man looks at someone who has handed him a tool he had not thought to ask for. "I don't have the coin for a long wire, miss." "Lynn." "Miss Lynn. Telegraph rates being what they are." "I know the rates," she said, and something dry crept into her voice despite herself. "I write them into the ledger every day. It would not need to be long. A man can ask a short question and get a short answer." He was quiet a moment, turning the flowers slightly in his hand, and Belhaven's afternoon noise filled the space between them. A wagon creaking past on the road behind the depot, a dog barking somewhere near the feed store, the particular tin rattle of the water tower settling in the heat. Then he said, "Would you help me word it? I've never sent one before. Never had cause to." "That's my job, Mr. Redding." "Tobias." "Mr. Redding," she said again, but there was the smallest curve at the corner of her mouth when she said it, and he did not miss it. They composed the wire together at the ticket counter, Lynn's pen quick and economical, cutting his rambling explanation down to the 11 words the rate would allow. Constance Whitfield expected Belhaven 3 weeks. Please advise status. T. Redding. He paid for it in coins counted out slow, the kind of counting a man does when he is watching every cent, and Lynn did not comment on that either, though she noticed, because noticing was half of what her job required, and the rest of it she could not seem to help. He came back the following Tuesday, though there was no train reason for him to be there, and he came back the Friday after, and by the 3rd week of this new arrangement, Lynn had stopped pretending to herself that she was only doing her job. She looked forward to the sound of his horse coming up the depot road. She had started noticing things about him that had nothing to do with telegrams, that he tipped his hat to her the same way he tipped it to the station master's wife, that he never once made her feel small the way some men who came through the depot did, speaking slow and loud as if her English required extra volume. He asked her opinion on things and waited for the answer. The reply from Springfield came on a Wednesday, 11 days after the wire was sent, and it was Lynn who took it off the wire herself and sat with it in her lap for the better part of an hour before Tobias arrived to collect it, because she did not know how to hand a man bad news gently, and she suspected there was no gentle way to hand him this. Constance Whitfield married locally June 14th. Regrets for silence. Letter to follow. He read it twice standing at the counter. Then he folded it along its crease with a care that seemed almost worse than if he had crumpled it, and he set it in his breast pocket beside, Lynn noticed, 3 weeks of her flowers he must have been carrying without her ever seeing. "Well," he said. Just that. "Well." "I'm sorry, Mr. Redding." "Nothing to be sorry for on your part. You did more than the arrangement required already." He looked out the depot window toward the corral where his horse stood switching flies with its tail, and something moved through his face that Lynn recognized, because she had felt its cousin herself, more than once, in this territory that did not make room easily for people who did not fit its expectations. Man spends 5 months writing letters to a woman he's never met, building a whole notion of a life in his head. Foolish, maybe, but it does not feel foolish while you're doing it. "It is not foolish," Lynn said, more sharply than she intended, and he looked at her in some surprise. Wanting a life with someone? Wanting it enough to write letters for 5 months to a stranger? That is not foolishness, Mr. Redding. That is only hope, and hope is not something a person ought to be ashamed of. He studied her for a long moment after that, longer than the conversation strictly required, and Lynn felt her own pulse doing something unruly under the gray collar of her borrowed dress. "You talk about it like you know something of the subject," he said. "I know something of waiting for things," she said, and did not elaborate, and he did not press her, and that restraint told her more about his character than any amount of talking could have. Belhaven, being a small town, did not keep such matters private for long. By the following week, half the depot regulars knew that the rancher out past Cutter's Creek had been jilted by a bride who never arrived, and opinions split predictably along the lines these things always split along. Some pitied him. Some, less kindly, said a man who could not secure a wife through ordinary courting had no business trying it through the mail, as though 5 months of honest letters were something shameful rather than something brave. It was Orrin Castellan who said it loudest, and said it in front of Lynn. Orrin Castellan owned the feed and grain store that sat across the road from the depot, and he had built a modest reputation as the sort of man whose opinions arrived louder than they were welcome. He was standing on the depot platform on a Friday morning, waiting on a freight shipment, when Tobias came through to check the mail window, and Orrin, feeling expansive in front of 2 other men he was hoping to impress, said, loud enough to carry the length of the platform, that some men could not tell a good arrangement from a bad one even when it was written plain as day in front of them, and that a girl worth having did not need to be ordered through the mail like a plow blade. Tobias went very still. Lynn, watching from the ticket window, saw his hands close slowly at his sides, saw the muscle in his jaw work once, and understood in that instant that this was the moment where the story could go one of several ways, and most of them ended badly for everyone standing on that platform. "You've got something to say to me directly, Castellan. You can say it directly," Tobias said, and his voice was quiet, which somehow made it worse than shouting would have. Orrin, who had not expected to be addressed rather than merely overheard, straightened up with the particular bluster of a man who has said too much to walk it back gracefully. "Only saying what half the town's already saying, Redding. Man your age still writing letters to strangers because he can't hold a woman's attention any other way?" What happened next happened fast enough that Lynn only understood the shape of it afterward, piecing it together from what she'd seen and what others told her later. Orrin, emboldened by his own audience, made the mistake of stepping closer and putting a hand flat against Tobias's chest to punctuate whatever insult he'd been building toward next, and Tobias, who had absorbed insult after insult without moving, did not absorb being put hands on. He caught Orrin's wrist before the shove landed fully, twisted it with an economy of motion that spoke of a man who had broken up more than one cattle-pen brawl in his years, and put Orrin down on one knee on the platform boards without throwing a single punch. It was over in 4 seconds. Orrin knelt there, red-faced, wrist held at an angle that clearly hurt without being broken, and the platform had gone very quiet, and every eye that had been watching the argument was now watching the 2 ranch hands who'd been Orrin's audience decide, wisely, not to involve themselves. "I did not come here looking for trouble," Tobias said, releasing Orrin's wrist and stepping back, breathing hard but level. "And I am not looking for it now. But I will not stand on a public platform and be told my hope was foolish by a man who has never risked anything harder than a bad harvest." He turned then, and his eyes found Lynn's through the ticket window, and there was something raw and unguarded in his face for just a moment before he mastered it, and Lynn, without entirely deciding to, stepped out from behind her counter and crossed the platform to stand beside him, close enough that anyone watching would understand exactly where her sympathies lay. "Mr. Castellan," she said, and her voice carried the flat precision she used for correcting freight manifests, which was somehow more cutting than shouting would have been. "You will find your grain shipment has already come in. It is sitting in the depot office. I would suggest you collect it and leave the platform to those of us with actual business here." Orrin looked between the 2 of them, calculation moving visibly behind his eyes, and whatever he saw in Lynn's expression convinced him that this particular fight had already cost him more than it was worth. He rose, brushed off his trousers, and left without another word, and the platform slowly resumed its ordinary noise, though Lynn could feel the eyes still on them, still weighing what they had just seen. That evening, after the last train had come and gone and the depot had emptied of its ordinary traffic, Tobias lingered by the water tower where he had first stood watching for a bride who never came. Lynn found him there while locking the ticket office, and something in the quality of the evening light, gold and low across the rails, made the moment feel private in a way the busy platform never was. "You did not need to speak up for me today," he said. "Could have made trouble for you. Castellan's the sort who remembers a slight." "I have been remembered by worse men than Orrin Castellan," Lynn said, and there was a weight in the words that made him look at her more carefully. "My uncle's business failed because a freight contractor decided he did not like doing business with a Chinese family and found excuses to cancel our routes one by one until there was nothing left to cancel. I know something of foolish hope, Mr. Redding. I have had to watch my own family's hope get dismantled by men who called their cruelty good business sense." He was quiet a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice had dropped its usual careful reserve. "I'm sorry for that, truly. I do not tell you for pity. I tell you so you understand why I would not stand quiet while another person's hope got mocked on a public platform. Hope is not a foolish thing, Mr. Redding, even when it disappoints you. It is the thing that gets a person up in the morning to try again." "Tobias," he said, "you keep calling me Mr. Redding like I'm a stranger you're processing a ticket for." "Are you not a stranger?" "I don't know that I am, any more. Not after everything these last weeks." He turned the last of the black-eyed Susans over in his fingers, the ones from that morning, still fresh. "I've been carrying flowers to this platform every Friday for going on 6 weeks now. First 3 for a woman who never came. Last 3, if I am honest with myself, because I found I wanted an excuse to see you before the next train came in." The confession sat between them in the gold evening light, plain and unadorned, the way honest things tended to be in this territory, and Lynn felt something loosen in her chest that she had been holding tight since the day her uncle's business failed, and she had decided, privately, that hope was a luxury she could not afford to indulge in again. "I am not a mail-order arrangement, Mr. Redding," she said, carefully. "I'm not a woman you write letters to and build a notion of in your head before you have ever met her properly." "No," he agreed. "You are a woman I have watched do her work with more care and more courage than most anyone I've known in this territory, and a woman who stood on a public platform today and put a man twice her size back in his place with nothing but her voice. I know exactly who you are, Miss Lynn. That is rather the point." She did not answer right away, and he did not push her to. They stood by the water tower as the light went from gold to the deep amber that came just before dusk in a Wyoming summer, and somewhere down the track a coyote called once and went silent, and Lynn found, when she finally spoke, that her voice was steadier than she expected. "Tuesday," she said. "There is a supper the station master's wife holds most Tuesdays for anyone who cares to come. It is not a courtship, Mr. Redding. It is a supper." "I understand the distinction," he said, and there was warmth in it now, real warmth, the first she had heard from him since the day the telegram brought its disappointing news. "I will be there Tuesday." He was there Tuesday, and the Tuesday after, and by August the whole of Belhaven had stopped pretending not to notice that the rancher from Cutter's Creek and the depot clerk had taken to walking the same stretch of road most evenings after her shift ended, deep in conversation that neither of them seemed in any hurry to finish. Some in town still muttered, Orrin Castellan chief among them, but muttering was a smaller thing than open confrontation, and Lynn had learned that a person could live a full life around the edges of small-minded muttering as long as they did not let it dictate their choices. But hope, as Lynn herself had noted, was a thing that could disappoint as easily as it could reward, and the territory was not finished testing them yet. It came in the form of a letter delivered to Lynn at the depot in late August from her uncle's former business partner, a man named Silas Vance, who held the paper on the freight contracts her uncle had lost. Vance, it turned out, had heard through territorial gossip that Lynn was being courted by a rancher of some standing, and Vance, whose finances had grown thin since he'd driven Lynn's uncle out of the freight trade and inherited the routes without the customer relationships to sustain them, saw an opportunity in that fact that had nothing to do with sentiment. The letter proposed, in language dressed up as generosity, that Lynn's uncle could have his old freight routes back, with Vance's blessing and a modest partnership, if Lynn would use her position at the depot to steer certain freight decisions Vance's way, decisions about which shipments got priority handling and which got quietly delayed, decisions that would let Vance undercut a rival freight company that had been eating into his remaining business. It was, stripped of its polite phrasing, a request that Lynn commit fraud against the railroad she worked for, dressed up as a favor to her family. She read the letter twice at her ticket counter, and then a third time, and felt something cold settle into her stomach that had nothing to do with the summer heat pressing against the depot windows. She did not tell Tobias immediately. It took her 3 days to work up the resolve, 3 days during which Vance sent a second letter, this one less polite, making clear that her uncle's continued struggles could be eased or worsened depending on how quickly she made her decision, and that word of her refusal would find its way to certain freight contractors who were already inclined to distrust doing business with her family. When she finally told Tobias, sitting on the porch of the station master's house during one of the Tuesday suppers, her voice shook in a way it rarely did. "I will not do it," she said. "I will not falsify freight priority for any man, not even to save my uncle's business. But I am afraid of what refusing will cost him. Vance has enough standing in the territory to make good on his threats." Tobias was quiet a long moment, his jaw working the way it did when he was turning something serious over in his mind. "Does the station master know of this letter?" "No, I did not want to bring trouble to my position before I had decided what to do." "You should tell him," Tobias said. "Not because you have done anything wrong, Lynn, but because Vance is asking you to commit fraud against the railroad's own freight schedules, and that is a crime with consequences that reach further than one clerk's job. The station master and the railroad have more power to answer a man like Vance than you or I do alone." It was, Lynn recognized, exactly the sort of clear-headed counsel she had come to expect from him, the kind that did not flinch from difficulty, but also did not rush toward drama for its own sake. She brought the letters to the station master the following morning, hands steady despite the fear still sitting in her chest. And the station master, a gruff man named Everett Boyle, who had never shown much warmth toward Lynn in 8 months of working together, surprised her by reading both letters with a darkening expression and then locking them in his desk drawer. "Vance has tried this sort of maneuver before," Boyle said. "Different clerk, different town, 3 years back. Railroad does not take kindly to attempted fraud against its freight priorities, Miss Lynn, and it takes even less kindly to a man threatening a clerk's family to secure it. I will be wiring the district superintendent today. You have done exactly the right thing bringing this to me." The resolution, when it came, arrived with the particular slowness of territorial justice, unfolding over several weeks rather than the single dramatic confrontation the situation might have suggested in a lesser telling. The district superintendent's investigation confirmed that Vance had attempted similar schemes with clerks in 2 other stations along the line, and the railroad, unwilling to have its freight priorities compromised by a man with a documented pattern of coercion, moved to formally exclude Vance's company from freight contracts along the entire division. It was not a dramatic downfall, no public shaming on a station platform, but it was thorough, and it left Vance with considerably less power to threaten anyone with in the future. Lynn's uncle, freed from Vance's shadow, and with a modest settlement the railroad extended as compensation for the original unjust cancellation of his routes years before, found himself able to rebuild a small freight operation of his own by early autumn, this time with contracts that did not depend on any single man's goodwill. 3 months passed after the resolution of the Vance affair, and Belhaven settled into the particular rhythm of a territory moving from summer into the long gold stretch of autumn. The black-eyed Susans that Tobias had once carried to the platform every Friday gave way to asters and goldenrod as the season turned, though he had long since stopped needing an excuse to bring Lynn flowers. They were married in October, in a ceremony at the station master's house that Everett Boyle insisted on hosting, a small gathering of the sort of people who had proven themselves worth keeping close. The station master and his wife, Lynn's uncle with his newly steady freight business, a handful of ranch hands from Cutter's Creek who had come to respect Tobias's quiet steadiness over the years, and, notably, none of the men who had once muttered about the arrangement, whose opinions had grown considerably quieter since the Vance affair had made clear exactly what kind of courage Lynn Toy possessed. Lynn kept her position at the depot, a fact that raised some eyebrows in a territory where married women were expected to retire into domestic life. But Everett Boyle, who had come by a genuine respect for her competence over the preceding months, made no move to replace her. And Tobias, for his part, never once suggested she should give up work that so plainly suited her. The ranch out past Cutter's Creek prospered that first year in ways that had less to do with luck than with the particular partnership that had formed it. Tobias had always been a capable rancher, but Lynn brought to their shared ledgers the same precision she had brought to the depot's freight manifests, and by the following spring the operation had expanded enough to hire on 2 additional hands, a fact that Tobias attributed, with the dry humor Lynn had come to love in him, entirely to his wife's insistence on knowing exactly where every dollar went. On the first Friday of the following summer, a full year after the day Constance Whitfield had failed to step down from the eastbound train, Tobias rode into Belhaven on ordinary business, stopping at the depot as he often did to see Lynn during her shift. He found her at the ticket window, and on the counter beside her ledger sat a small jar of black-eyed Susans, gathered that morning from the meadow behind their ranch house, the same flower he had once carried week after week for a woman who never arrived. "You kept the tradition," he said, leaning against the counter. "I found I liked the flower," Lynn said, "long before I understood I liked the man who kept bringing it." He smiled, the easy smile that had become familiar to her over the past year, the one that had once been so rare and guarded on the platform where they'd first spoken. "Funny thing, waiting for something that never comes," he said. "A man can spend so long looking down the track for one particular arrival that he nearly misses the thing standing right in front of him the whole while." "You did not miss it," Lynn said. "You only needed someone to ask the right question." "Who was I waiting for?" he said, remembering. "Best question anyone ever put to me." Outside, the afternoon train sounded its whistle somewhere down the western grade, and the platform began its familiar stir of activity, passengers gathering their bags, the station master stepping out to check his pocket watch against the schedule. Lynn closed her ledger and came out from behind the counter to stand beside her husband in the gold summer light, and neither of them watched the track with any particular urgency, because whatever they had once been waiting for, They had long since found it, standing where they stood. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.